So first I start off with the model to work out the concepts of the tree and the fireplace at its roots. And then it's on to the studio to get going on the first phase of the project. Here I had 3 wonderful assistants, and together we had a great time and we were able to accomplish a lot. It was great fun having Daly apprentice with me. Here she is with her first forged project. And it was a real pleasure to work with Glenn. I'm so happy he joined us on this project. And toward the end, we're fortunate to have Joseph join us as well. So now we fire up the forge and get on with the project. So we started off with forging I-beam for the main structure of the tree, and then move on to forging channel for the roots and the main kind of bark texture of the tree, and then move on to making the actual trunk of the tree. As with most projects, we start off with the chop saw, cutting up a bunch of material to work with. And here I move on to forging the 2-inch channel. The first step is taking it to the power hammer, where I kind of crease the metal, and then I move it on to the anvil, where I finish shaping the metal. My idea with these channel components was to stagger them to create a heavy bark texture and gnarly roots. So we made many of these pieces. And after they're forged, of course, they're all wire brushed to clean up all the scale, and then welded into the tree. I also forged this 2-inch channel in a different manner by twisting it so that I could create roots that looked more viney and reaching. After the various components are forged, they usually need to be trimmed up a little bit and cleaned up, having the edges refined. That's usually done with a grinder, as you see Glenn doing right here. Then after that, they all get wire brushed. And here we see Daly wire brushing those pieces. Once everything's been wire brushed, we start assembling it into the tree, starting off at the roots and working our way up the trunk. I use the I-beam as the main structural components of the tree, and also kind of the main trajectory of each root section. Then we began to fill out the tree with the steel sheet triangles, making sure to leave space between them to let the light out from the fireplace below. This process is very much kind of a back and forth process. You put the pieces on, you have to readjust them to make sure that they work from all sides, and then at the same time we're constantly checking to make sure that they actually let the light out in such a way that is pleasing and works from all directions as well. So once we've made sure that the piece works both in low light and normal light, the piece is pretty much ready to go. And the next part is actually adding the texture. And my idea with the texture was to have it kind of transition from really organic bark-like texture, transitioning into more of the regular steel triangle. Then we got the piece ready for transport and moved it to Moab, where we met with Henderson Construction and loaded it up on the forklift, and together we moved it upstairs. There we actually had to remove major sections of the sculpture just in order to stand it up. We then moved it into place and waited for the venting to be run through the sculpture before we could proceed to the next phase. As I was trying to figure out how to proceed with the second phase of the project, I was also admiring these beautiful fuchsia flowers and thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could figure out how to forge these flowers and incorporate them into the tree? So I decided to do some experiments in exactly that. As I was working out the prototype for this flower, I came up with the idea of incorporating fairy lights as the stamens of the flower, and I thought that would be a really beautiful effect, especially with the use of the punch plate for the inner petals of the flower. One of the most challenging parts of phase 2 was the fact that I had to make the components for the tree in the studio without actually having the tree there. So it took an enormous amount of measuring and remeasuring. Back at the studio, I proceeded to make the flowers from 2-inch pipe. I laid out the pipe, stuck it in the forge to heat it up, and proceeded to forge this pipe on the power hammer, starting with sectioning it off into 2 sections. One would later become the petals and the other the bud of the flower. Once the pipe has been necked down to the proper dimensions, I lay out where the petals will need to be cut and go ahead and cut it. And then I reheat the petals and hammer out each petal to at least twice the thickness of what it started with. As I continue to work on refining the petals, I have to actually separate out one petal at a time from the rest of the petals in order to be able to work on them, and also to be able to fit the flower into the forge. I start off with creasing the petal, and I do that with the use of a jig that I built to use in my treadle hammer, just specifically for putting that center crease in the flower. I continue to shape the flower at the anvil, and as I shape it I also have to go back to touch up the crease, and then eventually I will also round the edges of each petal. Once I've completed all the outer petals of the flower, I move on to the inner petals, which I make from 1/8 inch punch plate. So I draw them out on the punch plate and cut them out with a plasma cutter. I then weld a rod to each piece so that I could hold it easier as I'm forging it. The next step is I take it over to the anvil and I basically smooth out the edges. I hammer down all the uneven places and make the edges nice, even, and smooth. Once the edges are finished, I take the piece to the power hammer, where I first work on refining the edges some more. I kind of just flatten the outside edges of the petal to create an even border and even thickness. And then I continue on to widen out the petal to its final shape. Then at the anvil, I curl and roll and basically create various shapes for the individual inner petals of the flower. Next, all the components are cleaned up and wire brushed and assembled into the final flower. And once the flower is all finished, we move on to doing the patina on the flowers. So I start off with clean steel, and I used water-based oxides with a hot application technique. So I basically use a torch to heat up the metal, and then I start stippling on the different oxides. This is a layered patina, so I basically start off laying down a base coat of white, and then I follow up with other colors, working back and forth with them to create the colors, tones, and textures that I like. After the patina is finished, the flower gets clear coated. In the studio, we also made leaves and branches, but I did not get a chance to get footage of all that. So after that, we moved on to the actual installation of these components at Zach's restaurant. So here, I was lucky enough to have two great helpers, Casey and Mitch, and they pretty much helped me with everything to make this installation happen. So here at Zach's, we pretty much had to reassemble everything we had to take off earlier and add in all the branches, leaves, and flowers that we made in the shop in the second phase. This process involves a lot of fitting and checking and making sure it works from all sides. Fitting the flowers involved quite a bit of additional fussing, simply because we also had to accommodate the electrical wiring that's going to have to be pulled in the future. Once we determined the location of the flowers, we had to cut holes in the branches, which were made from 2-inch pipes with a plasma cutter, so that we could fit the smaller pipes of the flower stems into those branches in order to feed through the electrical wire after the piece is completed. Once the holes were cut, then I would come in and clean it up with the die grinder to get it prepped up for welding. You know what, I bet that's pretty good. Do you still have your test piece? Oh yeah. Then we had to drill additional holes for running the wires. We ran baling wire through the flower and all the pipes and the holes that we had drilled earlier so that the electrical wire could be hooked up to the baling wire and pulled through at a later date. Once all that fussing was complete, I could finally focus on welding in the flower stems. After everything was fit and welded and finished, then all the discolored areas had to be cleaned up. I touched up the patina and then finally clear coated the tree. At this point, the tree is basically finished and just waiting for the lighting system to be installed.